The Professor's Digital Dojo.
It's day 13. I'm exhausted. I really haven't been sleeping much. Haven't gone out in days. Feels like forever. My wife's been ill for nearly 2 weeks, and we're down to our last roll of toilet paper. Trash is piling up. There's no sports on TV, and I've watched everything that I really want to watch on Netflix. Put on a face mask the other day and went to Costco, and shelves were empty. So I bought a 5-pound bag of frozen peas and some cornstarch. I'm not sure how long we'll be able to survive on that. I think I'm losing my Alright guys, and I had a Prozac smoothie, and now I'm feeling a little bit better. Of course I was joking. All jokes aside, I hope everybody's doing well out there and that these lessons are helping you and you're keeping up with everything, keeping your social distancing, washing your hands, and eating a good breakfast. Alright, so in the last demo we went in and created the proper white point for our video so that we'd have a good starting place for everything. And as we talked about, that is our first default node, is our white point node. But now we need to correct the tonal values in our videos. And once again, what comes right out of the camera is generally not what we want to use in our final product. That said, of course, as long as you have a proper exposure, we're going to have a much easier time working with our video. And both of my pieces of footage here were exposed accurately and properly, and this gives me a much broader tonal range. I also shoot in a color space known as C-Log, which tends to give one a bit of a flatter image. In other words, the contrast is a little bit lower, and that's intentional so that I can make more sort of dramatic corrections in the final product, and that's pretty standard workflow for video footage. But what we want to do today is we want to correct the values within the frame, because nothing is actually where it really is supposed to be at this point. So we're going to open our scopes again. So once again, if I right click inside of my display window here and click Show Scopes, and once again I'm going to reduce my view from 4 scopes to 1. And once again, if it doesn't default to waveform, I want everyone to switch their scope to waveform. This is a little bit easier for someone to translate if they're not quite used to doing this, and it's really a valuable display when we're working with our highlights, midtones, and shadows. So let's get to it. So the first thing we want to look at is down here in our color grading module. You'll see what these are called primary wheels, and our color wheels. So what I want to do first is I want to deal with the gain in my image. And if you're not sure what gain is, if you grab this little tool right here, these are meant to mimic control boards that we use physically. Gain is basically the highlights and brights in our image. 1023 is our highest value, and I don't want to go above that with my brightest values. And I actually do scrub through my footage to see where my bright values are, and for now the brightest value within this piece of footage is here, this window area, and you can see those tones right here in the scope. So I want to roll my gain wheel and lift those highlights just up to the point where they're just touching. that 1023 line. That's my brightest point line. In fact, if we look, I'm going to zoom in a bit on this clip here. There we go. I just use my scroll wheel to zoom in and my middle mouse button to pan around inside of the clip. I can see that I've got detail in my highlights here, but if I roll my gain value too high, it starts to clip a lot of that detail out, and that's something I really want to avoid. Now, if you're looking and you're sort of like, well, my highlights look good, but the other sort of brights in my image don't look good, don't worry about that. What we want to deal with right now are just our brightest points, and we'll deal with a lot of these other values as we continue to color grade our image. So I've set my white point correctly. I'll move that out. Set my white point correctly in this first node. And I'm using this first node to also set my gain, my gamma, and my lift. So we just set our gain here. Gamma describes your midtones, and this 512 line are our midtones. And in fact, if we look in here, there's quite a lot of midtones. There's low midtones, there's high midtones, and there's midtones. And it takes a bit of practice to know what's what, or maybe some experience. But if I roll this gamma wheel, I want to lift these values so that most of them occupy this middle line. So if I do so, if I start to lift this up, you can see that I'm getting most of these midtones in here, as you can see here, to occupy this middle line. So I'm bringing them up. Now I want to use my lift, which controls my shadows, to make sure that my deepest, richest shadows, which are here, these sort of blacks in this railing, and you can see them kind of here, that those touch the bottommost 0 line, which is our true black. So I'm going to roll that down. And there we go. That is a correct value setting for the footage. So here, in our first node, we've set correct white point, remember, by rolling our temperature. And we've set the correct gain, gamma, and lift for our image. And if we want to see the before and after, I can toggle this number 1 here. This is my footage before, this is my footage corrected. So before with a close to correct white point and close to correct values, and after with a correct white point and correct values. If I scrub this footage, you can see how much better everything looks. Before, very flat, C-log profile. After, values and white point corrected. Now, a lot of people would be tempted at this point to think, well, that's it. It looks great. I'm going to use it. Not so fast. This is not our finalized footage. There's still a lot of work that we need to do on it. And that's what we'll use our other nodes for going forward. I want to try to expand this stuff out a little bit. This is one of the things about DaVinci that drives me kind of crazy. I generally move this to a separate monitor so it can take up more space. You guys on laptops, it will feel a little bit cramped, but you get used to it in due time. One of the other things I want to talk about here, whoops, I'm going to show this side by side. I'm going to pull that out for now. We'll grab that a little bit later as we go further into the demo. So one of the things I want to talk about right now is I'm going to go and do the same thing for this footage. I'm going to show my scopes. I've got my waveform here. And I'm going to correct the values on these. So once again, I'm going to scroll to a part of the footage, move the playhead where I can see some highlights, and they're right here. And I can control my gain. Once again, if I push them too far off the scale, I start to clip these values in here, and I don't want to do that. I want to maintain as much detail as possible, and you can see there's a bit of detail in this stucco. But I do want to get a correct, proper highlight. So I'm bringing the highest white point just up to our top 1023 line. Next, I'll move to my gamma. I'm going to scroll this out a bit. Next, I'll move over to my gamma to control my midtones, which these are really a perfect description of our midtones. That's a middle gray in here, this value right here. So I can just roll this value right up to the 512 line, right there, and I have a proper midtone range. Now, to many of your eye, this may look a bit sort of blown out right now. We're going to correct that a little bit more here in a second. So I'm going to scroll where I can see some shadows. We've got quite a few shadows sort of in here and whatnot. And I'm going to use my eye just to bring that lift down to a point where things are just touching. These values in here are just touching that bottom line. Tiny bit more, about right there. That looks pretty good. So once again, if we look at our before and after, we've now corrected our values. And once again, I know many of you may look at this and think that, wow, that's super subtle. But remember, as artists, most of what we do is quite subtle. So that's our work with node 1, correcting our values, making sure we have a proper white point, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't end there. There are a few other things we can do here in our first node. And one of the things I can do, if I like, I can tweak the contrast a little bit. I can increase it or decrease it, so on and so forth. But I'll tell you why I generally don't do that here as we move on. I can pull my saturation down if I like. I can even shift the hue of the image. And I have luminance mix. So these are a couple of other corrections I can make. And back on tab 2, where we control the temperature of our footage, I can go into tint, and I can tint the footage a bit magenta or a bit greener if I need to. I can increase midtone detail. And this is actually something I generally do. I generally do increase midtone detail to about 18, as long as my footage supports it. And what I mean by that is as long as it's not introducing a lot of noise or anything like that. And I can even control my shadows and my highlights here a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase shadow detail a tiny bit, and I'm going to increase, pull down highlight detail just a tiny bit. And so now we started with a very proper value range, and they're still holding steady in all those spots, but I'm doing sort of like overrides on shadows, highlights, and things like midtone detail here in the bottom after I've set these proper values. So I can tweak things a little bit more in this space. I can even boost my color if I so choose, although I want to be a little careful about that. I prefer a much more naturalistic color, and we are going to do color grading later on, but if I wanted to, I could boost that color up, as you can see, and that really gives it a real hit of color. I'm going to Control Z that. I much prefer to start in this first node, and I suggest you do the same thing with a neutral color that comes from just a proper white point and proper value settings. And I'd in fact be pretty careful about going in and cranking these things too high. And you'll see why as we add our second node, one of our color grade nodes, in the next demo. So that should be enough for now. Hopefully you guys are doing well, picking up all this stuff, and it's helping out. So we'll check in next time where we're doing the rest of our color grading demo.